What if everything you were taught about good and evil was useless when it comes to power? What if, deep down, what we truly respect isn't kindness, but strength? This uncomfortable and piercing idea is the one Niccolò Machiavelli dared to put on the table more than 500 years ago, and even today, it still hits like a slap in the face of good intentions. We're surrounded by speeches about justice, empathy, honesty, and morality, but when we look closely at those who have reached positions of power, whether in politics, business, or even personal relationships, we rarely find saints. We find strategists. We find people who weren't always fair, but they were effective, who knew how to play the game better than others, who knew when to lie, when to stay silent, when to act with a firm hand, and when to fake tenderness they didn't feel. Does that make them monsters? Or simply awake? Machiavelli wrote for the awake, for those who have sensed that reality doesn't work the way we wish it did, that the good don't always win, that telling the truth isn't always wise. That power, like a wild animal, doesn't let itself be petted for long. It must be seized, tamed, and watched. And for that, a different set of rules is needed. Imagine you've just taken control of a company, a nation, or a group. People smile at you, but they're also sizing you up. Some applaud, others whisper, others wait for you to stumble. What do? Do you act kindly, hoping that will disarm your adversaries? Or do you study the terrain, identify threats, and make quick, perhaps even cruel, decisions to secure your place? These are the questions Machiavelli dared to ask, without disguise, without decoration. Not to promote cynicism, but to reveal that the reality of power is woven from much harsher threads than those found in fairy tales. Because there's a bitter truth at the heart of it. Kindness without strength is harmless, and strength without strategy is clumsy. Machiavelli understood that ruling requires more than goodwill. It requires adaptability, a clear-eyed understanding of human nature, the ability to anticipate betrayal, even from the most smiling allies. It's a worldview that makes people uncomfortable, but also sets them free. Free from blind idealism, from paralyzing naivety, from that eternal waiting for things to be how they should be, instead of seeing them as they are. When Machiavelli says it's better to be feared than loved, he's not promoting sadism. He's saying, if you have to choose between ensuring your survival or pleasing everyone, choose to survive. Because love is fickle, but well-managed fear is a more reliable tool of control. It sounds harsh. It is. But how many times have you seen good people devoured by systems that don't reward goodness? How many times have you stayed silent or faked affection because you knew that's what your environment demanded? We've all played that game at some point. The difference is, Machiavelli wasn't ashamed to admit it. And even more provocative is his idea that the ends justify the means. Not because he believed any means were acceptable, but because he understood that in power dynamics, results matter more than intentions. No one remembers the scruples of those who fail. But everyone keeps talking about those who succeed, even if their path was paved with shadowy decisions. In a world where appearances matter most, where history is written by the victors, this logic becomes hard to refute. What's fascinating is that Machiavelli doesn't idealize the leader as a virtuous hero, but as an actor. Someone who knows when to show a kind face and when to act with cold precision. Not because they're hypocritical, but because they understand that human emotions, like loyalty, love, or gratitude, are unstable. And if you build only on those, you're building on sand. The leader, then, becomes a tightrope walker between appearance and action, between what is shown and what is hidden. And that dance, morally ambiguous as it may be, is often what determines whether one dominates or falls. Would we prefer to live in a world where such calculations aren't necessary? Maybe, but Machiavelli didn't write for an ideal world. He wrote for those who live on the battlefield of reality, where betrayal is possible, where allies can turn into rivals, where weakness smells like blood, where power is a fire you can't touch without getting burned, but everyone wants to get close to it. And yet, there's something profoundly human in this vision. Machiavelli doesn't invite us to dehumanize ourselves. He invites us to know ourselves better, to recognize our shadows, to see that within every human lives both the fox and the lion, that we all want safety, but also respect, that we all want to be loved, but also feared, if that guarantees we won't be taken advantage of, that we all play, consciously or not, to protect what we consider ours. The difference lies in who admits it, and who hides behind speeches that collapse under the weight of real power. Maybe that's why Machiavelli makes us so uncomfortable, because he speaks to us from a troubling mirror, because he reminds us that morality and politics don't always walk hand in hand, because he forces us to ask, how far are we willing to go to protect what we've gained? Could we make hard decisions without breaking inside? Do we really understand how power works? Or do we just repeat what we wish were true? To dominate in the Machiavellian view is not to be cruel for cruelty's sake. It's to understand that the world doesn't always reward the just. That virtue, without strategy, fades into oblivion. That nobility without strength is decorative, but not governing. And that a true leader is someone who can act with harshness when needed and with mercy when it's useful. Because in the game of power, balance isn't found in pure ethics, but in precise calculation. There's no room here for the naive, but there is room for those who want to understand the art of power without hypocrisy. For those who realize that leadership, like life itself, requires more than good intentions. It requires intelligence that it requires coldness. And above all, it requires the courage to look power in the eye without blinking. To dominate is not to conquer once. It is to sustain the conquest. It is to understand that the summit is only the beginning of constant vigilance. Power is not something you own, it's something you maintain. And to maintain it, you must play a game far more complex than the one that won you the initial victory. A game with no rest, where a single misstep can cost you years of effort, and where others' perception is just as important as reality. Because for Machiavelli, being strong is not enough. You must appear strong. We live in a theater. In politics, in business, even in daily life. Everyone plays roles, everyone hides their weaknesses, everyone performs what they think the environment expects of them. The true dominator doesn't despise this game, he perfects it. He knows that image is power, that a single show of weakness, a poorly calculated apology, a misplaced act of compassion, a moment of hesitation in conflict, can become a crack through which snakes slither in. That's why the leader who dominates guards his mask like a crown. Not because he is fake, but because he understands that raw sincerity is not always a virtue. Sometimes it's a vulnerability. And if one wonders why this feels so real, so disturbingly true, all you have to do is look around. The bosses who inspire respect are those who know how to impose themselves, not necessarily the most generous ones. The politicians who endure are those who know when to yield and when to strike, not those who cling to impossible ideals. Even in our closest relationships, the balance of power never disappears entirely. There are moments when silence grants more dominance than words, and gestures that speak louder than 1,000 arguments. Power lies in the details, in knowing how to read another's silence, in measuring consequences before acting, in acting like the fox that senses the trap and the lion that's not afraid to crush it. Machiavelli knew that cruelty, when well used, is not brutality, it's calculation. A hard decision made at the right time can prevent years of chaos. A leader who acts with firmness at the crucial moment may seem ruthless, but what he's really doing is planting order. Lukewarmness, on the other hand, invites disobedience. No one loyally follows someone who won't dare to decide. No one respects someone who hides behind doubt. Power, like sacred fire, demands sacrifice. Sometimes, the sacrifice is the need for approval itself. And here lies another uncomfortable truth. The one who seeks to dominate cannot aim to please everyone. Because those who try to please everyone end up being manipulated by everyone. The true leader knows that love is fragile, volatile, dependent on 1,000 factors outside his control. Fear, on the other hand, when it's not hatred, can be maintained. It's not about terrorizing, but about being unpredictable. About not being someone easy to read or underestimate. Because if others feel they can predict your every move, they no longer fear you. And if they don't fear you, then you no longer dominate anything. This doesn't mean becoming a tyrant. It means understanding that authority requires distance. It requires the art of not always being available, of knowing when to speak and when silence should outweigh words. It requires mastering one's impulses, because those who are ruled by anger lose control. Those enslaved by their emotions can't dominate anyone. Machiavelli knew it. The greatest strength is not brute force, it's self-control. The one who can fake calm in the middle of chaos is more powerful than the one who yells and slams the table. Even more essential is flexibility. The rigid leader, no matter how virtuous, breaks when the wind changes. But the one who knows how to adapt to circumstances, who transforms without losing their essence, that one endures. Because fortune, said Machiavelli, is like a raging river. It sweeps away everything in its path, but those who build defenses in time, those who don't underestimate it, manage to resist. The one who dominates doesn't hope for things to go well. He anticipates things going wrong. And he prepares. Quietly, intelligently, coldly. There's no room for nostalgia in this game. The past grants no legitimacy. Each day is a new battle to preserve what has been won. Enemies disguise themselves as allies. Yesterday's victories don't guarantee tomorrow's respect. The leader who dominates remains alert, eyes open even when everyone applauds. Because he knows applause can also be a trap. That excessive praise may be the prelude to betrayal. That those who smile today may be digging his downfall. But domination is not about living in paranoia. It's about living awake. It's about understanding that human beings change, that loyalties are fragile, that values don't always survive the pressure of self-interest. And accepting that doesn't mean becoming cruel. It means becoming clear-sighted. It means realizing that being right is not enough. You must know when to speak, how to speak, and whether it's even worth speaking. Sometimes, silence is more commanding than the most brilliant speech. Sometimes, a tactical retreat is stronger than a frontal confrontation. There's something deeply stoic in Machiavelli's vision of domination. The idea that we can't control the world, but we can control our reaction to it. That we can't prevent betrayal, but we can prepare for it. That we can't stop people from hating us, but we can prevent that hatred from destroying us. The one who dominates, by this logic, is not invulnerable, but he's harder to bring down. Because he doesn't depend on constant approval, but on his own ability to reinvent himself. There is beauty in that harshness. Not because it glorifies cynicism, but because it brings us back to the world as it really is. It reminds us that even cruelty can contain wisdom, and that within strategy lies a kind of truth that is rarely spoken aloud. The truth that not everyone who smiles is a friend. That sometimes you must dirty your hands to protect what matters. That in a world where everyone is pretending something, the one who dominates is the one who pretends best. Or the one who no longer needs to pretend, because everyone already fears him. Perhaps the most unsettling part of all this is that, in the end, Machiavelli didn't write for tyrants. He wrote for realists. For those who know that to live is also to defend yourself. That to lead is to expose yourself. That to rule is often to walk a tightrope. And that to dominate, that feared and desired verb, is not an empty ambition, but a way to protect what one has built with great effort. A way not to be devoured by those who have no qualms about doing so. And then, when all is said and done, when the dust of battle settles and the masks begin to slip, one question remains, burning like a silent flame. Is it worth it to dominate? Is it worth living on guard, always balanced between clarity and coldness, between prudence and calculation? The answer, perhaps, doesn't lie in a sharp phrase, but in the silence that follows that question. A silence full of nuance, contradictions, and partial truths. To dominate, as Machiavelli understood it, is not an act of inflated ego, nor an adolescent fantasy of absolute power. It is, in truth, a response to human nature. A bitter response, yes, but a profoundly honest one. Because history is not written by the naive, but by those who knew how to anticipate danger, move with cunning, and make cold-blooded decisions when everyone else was trembling. Not because they were cruel, but because they understood that the world rarely rewards naked kindness. We are surrounded by ideals that celebrate transparency, purity, authenticity. And yet, we remain captive to structures that reward strategy, appearance, and emotional control. We are taught to be good, but life, as it truly is, forces us to be strong. And that's where many get lost, in nostalgia for a world that doesn't exist. Because, as much as we'd like to believe otherwise, the wolf still lurks, the traitor still waits for his moment, and today's friend can become tomorrow's rival. Does that make us cynical? Not necessarily. It makes us adults. It forces us to let go of the fantasy that we can live without conflict, without tension, without power dynamics. It confronts us with the brutal, but liberating fact that life is also a game board, and those who don't know how to move become just another piece. The piece that can be sacrificed. And yet, amid so much coldness, a strange kind of beauty emerges. The beauty of someone who dominates not because they crave control over others, but because they refuse to be controlled. Someone who doesn't seek to be loved by everyone, but respected by those who matter. Someone who doesn't fear conflict, but doesn't chase it either. Someone who can make hard choices without turning to stone inside. Because yes, you can dominate without losing your soul, but not without wounding it a little. There's a kind of melancholy in living this way. A constant awareness that every gesture matters, that every word can be used for or against you, that every glance might be a reading. And those who've walked this path know there's no other way to protect what they truly value. Not because they distrust for sport, but because they've seen what happens when you surrender yourself, unfiltered, to the goodwill of others. When you assume love is eternal, loyalty unbreakable, and justice automatic. Life taught them otherwise. It taught them that love can turn into demands, that loyalty can be bought, and that justice, without strength, is just a pretty word. That's why the one who dominates does so with open eyes, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Because they've chosen not to be a victim. They've chosen to pay the price of control rather than the price of naivety. And that price, although not always visible, is steep. Sometimes it's loneliness. Sometimes it's being misunderstood. Sometimes it's the burden of having to decide when everyone else waits for someone else to do it. But there's also freedom in that price. The freedom of not being manipulated by every passing emotion. The freedom of not begging for affection. The freedom of not depending on the world's mood to know who you are. The one who dominates, with all it entails, is also the one who can stand tall when everything around them is falling apart. Because they've built a castle within. Because they've learned to trust their own judgment when external voices contradict one another. Because they've made silence their refuge, strategy their defense, and firmness their compass. Still, it's not about living with a closed heart. On the contrary, it's about knowing when to open it, with whom, and how far. It's about managing one's own vulnerability like a treasure, not out of greed, but out of self-respect. It's about offering love from strength, not from need. And about understanding that compassion is not incompatible with authority, as long as one remembers their place. Because the one who dominates with compassion without losing control is far more feared and respected than the one who dominates through pure fear. But that requires deep maturity, a rejection of the comfort of sentimentality, a commitment to clarity. It requires asking uncomfortable questions. Am I acting out of fear or strategy? Am I giving in because it's right or because I want to avoid conflict? Am I being kind or seeking approval? The one who dominates asks themselves these questions constantly, because they know the line between emotional intelligence and self-deception is thin, very thin. And maybe, in the end, to dominate is nothing more than to master oneself, to control one's own reactions, to master the impulse to be understood by everyone, to master the urgency to prove, to justify, to explain. Because true power is born from inner silence, from that ability to observe without reacting, to decide without shouting, to hold someone's gaze when everyone else looks away. Whoever achieves that has already won, even if no one celebrates it. And there lies the paradox. The one who dominates often doesn't need to show it. They don't need thrones or applause. They don't need titles or recognition. Their dominance is felt in how they enter a room, in how others lower their voices when they speak, in how decisions orbit around their judgment, even if their name isn't mentioned. True dominance is silent, elegant, almost invisible. And that's exactly where its power lies. Perhaps we can never escape the game of power, but we can choose to play it with dignity, with intelligence, with a personal ethic, firm like a pillar. An ethic that doesn't need to be shouted because it's embodied in how one lives, in how one acts when no one is watching, in the consistency with which one holds to their center, even as everything else changes. Because the hardest thing is not dominating others. It's not losing yourself in the process of doing so. Maybe that's where the real art lies, in keeping the soul intact amid the battles, in not forgetting what you want to protect, even while making hard choices, in not going blind with power, in remembering that the end doesn't justify every means, but that without the right means, the ends dissolve, and that whoever isn't willing to take risks shouldn't aspire to lead anything. And so, with a heart full of scars, but also of clarity, the one who dominates moves forward, not as a tyrant, not as a monster, but as someone who's seen what lies behind the curtain and still chooses to keep walking. Someone who has understood that in an imperfect world, domination is not a cruel imposition, but an act of responsibility, an act of courage, an act perhaps of love, but not a soft, naive, or compliant love, a firm love, a love that protects, a love that knows how to say no, a love that knows when to walk away and when to strike. That is the kind of dominance that matters. The kind that doesn't need to shout to be felt. The kind that doesn't destroy others, but won't be destroyed either. The kind that doesn't fear conflict, but doesn't feed it. The kind that doesn't seek to be feared, but earns respect. The kind that remembers that domination is, at times, the hardest and most noble way to protect what truly matters.